Guys, what a Singapore Grand Prix we just watched. This relatively will probably be a pretty quick recap of the Singapore Grand Prix just because really, outside of a couple of key points, which we will go over, kind of not really a whole lot else happened. And so we're going to hit on those couple of points in our quick hits. We'll quickly go over our weekend winners and losers, and then we'll take a look at our predictions results and take a final look at our predictions standings for our community championship before we look ahead and see what is next. But without further ado, guys, let's go ahead. Let's jump on into this Singapore Grand Prix reaction. Where else could we possibly begin than the very front, as we always do? George Russell and Mercedes deciding to randomly pull one of their weekends where they decide, actually, I do know what I'm doing, and we're going to dominate from the end of qualifying all the way through the end of the race. George Russell takes pole position away from both Max Verstappen and both McLarens, and ends up taking home a win here in Singapore in dominating fashion. He led from the jump, he led the entire way, and did not really have much to worry about in the grand scheme of things. So George Russell comes home to get another win for Mercedes this year. It was another one of those weekends where, similar to Canada from this season, where it just for whatever reason Mercedes decided, I'm going to be quick this weekend and we're going to prove it right here, right now. He put it on pole position by a couple of tenths over Max Verstappen and well over a few tenths over both McLarens. And then I think he was definitely helped by the Max Verstappen Lando Norris battle, as well as, the Oscar Piastri situation. But at the same time, he was there. He didn't put a single foot wrong and ends up taking home a win in Singapore. It is a very good weekend for George, who apparently is coming close or has already reached an agreement on the future of his contract with Mercedes. And so this will be another feather in his cap as he continues to march forward in his career. But we need to move on and talk about what probably is actually the biggest talking point of this weekend, which is obviously a lot of the McLaren drama. You have them officially sealing the Constructors' Championship this season. I don't think anyone is too surprised by that. The way they were talking about it at points over the weekend was, I don't know if there was really any jeopardy on their minds when it came to this, but at the same time, I think this was a foregone conclusion that has been in the cards for a more than a good chunk of the season already gone. So congratulations to McLaren for winning their back-to-back constructors titles, and it definitely looks like, at least as of right now, they're still on track to take home both titles here in 2025, but we'll get on to that because we need to talk about Lando Norris going full argy-bargy on the opening lap of this one. Obviously makes contact with both Max Verstappen and his own teammate going into turn 3. Oscar ends up being pushed wide, and effectively that was his chance at a podium done from there. Lando had a bit of damage that did not apparently seem to cause him much issue over the course of these 60 odd laps. But at the end of the day, this was probably something that we hadn't seen from the McLaren duo. So far this season, we've seen obviously a lot of talk about papaya rules. We've seen them be very attempt at diplomacy between their two drivers in instances, and this was probably the first instance where we'll see the mask of that start to crack here. It was a PR nightmare basically for McLaren the rest of the way. You have Oscar coming over the radio basically asking for an explanation on why that was okay and why they're not trying to make it right, as we've seen so many times over the last season and a half, calendar season. And it is going to be very interesting to see what happens from here. There is also the drama of Oscar's slow stop, which obviously isn't necessarily McLaren's fault per se, but it definitely kept Oscar from challenging too much. But at the end of the day, this is going to get very interesting, and I cannot wait to see what happens next. It is a something that I think a lot of us have been waiting on basically from the moment the season began, and it's going to get very, very interesting to see what comes next. So we'll keep an eye on this space, but with only 6 rounds left in 3 sprint races, it could heat up mightily. As I mentioned, not really a whole lot else really went on in this race outside of a couple of slow pit stops. I mentioned the Oscar Piastri pit stop, and there was also a Fernando Alonso slow pit stop that ultimately provided at least a little bit of drama down the stretch in this one. Realistically, it was an instance where the quick cars were able to move forward, these slow cars were slow. There were no retirements, safety cars. There were very few yellow flags outside of a couple of incidents a la Nico Hülkenberg. Gabriel Bortoleto also getting involved early and having to make some pit stops and things like that. But ultimately, a pretty quiet race all around, and it was not really a whole lot going on. There was a couple of drivers out there who tried to make these crazy, strategies happen, but at the end of the day, with no VSEs, full safety cars, or anything of the like, it was basically just one of those races again. So outside of a couple of moments, not really a whole lot to talk about, but we will talk about Lewis Hamilton and his brakes officially shattering. Watching the replay where his front left brake disc brake pad likely disintegrated finally. And then obviously the drama with him and Fernando going to the line there at the end on the last lap. It was a weird situation, which I feel like we haven't seen in a while, where we've seen, drivers complain about losing the brakes or having, these issues. But at the end of the day, I think it's very rare that you see full-blown, tangible evidence that something really, really went wrong. We saw Lewis battling with Kimi Antonelli. Ultimately, his front left brake pad exploded, and he effectively had no brakes and lost a buku amount of time the rest of the race before ultimately earning himself a 5-second penalty when the race was all said and done for going off the track without, mitigating circumstances, thus handing a place to Fernando Alonso, with Lewis finishing in 8th and Fernando moving up to 7th. So it was a wild moment, and not something you see every day, but figured it was worth a shout out. Speaking of deserving a shout out, there's a couple of drivers I do want to mention here. First is Ollie Behrman, another solid result for the young rookie driver in the Haas. Definitely had me on the edge of my seat over the course of this one, as we saw him try and secure himself another top 10 finish this season. I believe this was his 5th top 10 finish of the season, and it is a solid result for a Haas team that is kind of struggling for pace. We saw his teammate Esteban Ocon really struggle over the course of the weekend, but Ollie really seemed to thrive in the situation. It took advantage of the track position that he got from his fantastic qualifying and brought it home in a P9, which could have been a P8, but the Aston Martin looked very much more on the pace this weekend in terms comparatively. So we will take that every single day of the week. And then another driver we have to mention is Carlos Sainz, who finished here in P10 after starting from basically the very, very back after both Williams cars were disqualified in qualifying. So Carlos did that strategy where he went extremely long, got advantage of a tire offset there right at the end, and took advantage. He did, because he made his way all the way back up to finish in the points. So I believe he started technically P18, but P18 to points sounds pretty good to me. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and move on quickly to our weekend winners and losers. We'll begin with weekend winner, and I'm going to start with my honorable mention for this weekend, and I'm going to go with Carlos Sainz in this one. I mentioned it just now that he started obviously from the very back and made his way back up into the points. It was a style of race and a result that you don't see too often at a street track like Singapore. Him carving up through the field there right at the end with a obviously much higher tire delta to the rest of the grid at that point. But it was a very impressive result nonetheless. I think I kind of blinked and looked up and realized that he finished P10 behind Ollie. And it was a fantastic drive from Carlos, and he deserves a definite mention here. But my weekend winner is going to be George Russell this weekend. I mentioned it at the top, but this was one of those weekends where Merc and George decided to just be on it from the jump. They showed a lot of really great pace leading up to qualifying, before ultimately putting in the lap when they needed it most to take pole position, and then taking advantage of Max and Lando battles to kind of drive off, use the clear air to his advantage, and get another win under his belt. It was another win for Mercedes this season, and a fantastic drive from George. So I think all in all, when you're looking at it, I think George Russell is more than deserving of my weekend winner. On the other hand, weekend loser I think was a little harder of a decision to make, but at the same time, I think I did end up picking the right entity for my weekend loser. My weekend loser for the Singapore Grand Prix weekend is Ferrari. I went back and forth on a lot of individual drivers not having the greatest races, Liam Lawson having some issues over the course of the weekend, but I think Ferrari probably is the most frustrating result, especially if you're a fan or in the team itself. I mean, they just seem to be absolutely nowhere. Obviously, we're reaching that point in this season with a new regulation era coming next season where they're not bringing upgrades probably for the rest of the season, and this is a car that they just cannot seem to get on top of. You have Charles Leclerc looking like he wants to be doing quite literally anything else, and you even have Lewis Hamilton, who at times can be optimistic to a fault, having issues kind of coming to terms with this car and what it really means. Obviously, he having to battle with no brakes for the last lap or so, considering his brake pad disintegrated into dust. It was a weekend where we've seen weekends like this before, right? Where Ferrari finished, 6th and 8th, and you kind of leave it going, well, that kind of sucked. But there was something in the air about this weekend where they were never in it. Like, ever. Even on their best laps, they were well off the pace. It looks like there are no answers coming, and at this point, it's probably going to be a pretty quick turnaround to Ferrari probably finishing potentially 4th in the constructors when they were looking very, very good and on pace for a solid constructors finish not that long ago. So unfortunately to say, Ferrari, you are my weekend loser. All right, let's move ahead now to our predictions results. Let's go over the predictions I made before the weekend began and see how we did and if we can rack up a solid amount of points as we try and claw our way back in the predictions championship in our community. And then we'll round things out with taking a look at those standings because we have some mix-ups at the top. But let's begin with my pick for biggest positive surprise, and I thought I was getting an easy point here. I went with Oscar Piastri, and while I could make an argument that, finishing the race, finishing in the points, not crashing are definite positive signs, it's very hard for me to give myself a point here when you have the championship leader as your pick, because he started in the top 3, was immediately overtaken by his teammates, and then ultimately a slow stop derailed his entire race, and he was never truly challenging for the podium or even the win. We talked about it a lot, but I could not in my good conscience give myself a point here because I think at minimum we needed to see Oscar on the podium for me to even to be able to make an argument. And realistically, we were probably looking at a top 2 or a win to get a surefire point. So unfortunate to say, in the easiest spot of the season, I cannot give myself a point here. So no points on my biggest positive surprise. But on the counterpoint, I will be giving myself a point for my biggest disappointment, where I went with Yuki Tsunoda, coming off of his best performance of the season in Azerbaijan. Never really looked comfortable here in Singapore. I think he had some decent pace at points over the course of the race, but was just kind of very anonymous over the course of the weekend, ultimately getting knocked out in Q2 with Max Verstappen, while not truly challenging for pole, starting on the front row and having a moment of fighting with the McLarens at the front. This was another one of those weekends where Yuki was just kind of anonymous, where at the end of the day is better than, the true depths that it could have been, but at the same time, Yuki just did not perform as well as he really needs to be doing. And I know Singapore is a very, very different track, and I kind of mentioned this in our predictions video, that I don't think Singapore truly suits the Red Bull very well. I think it was just Max Verstappen that had a overachieving weekend, and Yuki Tsunoda just a very disappointing one considering where his teammate is. As we move on for my qualifying predictions, and this is actually where a bit of fortune favors me, as my qualifying order prediction was a Lando Norris pole position, a Max Verstappen P2, and an Oscar Piastri P3. And while Lando did start in P5, and this one not really getting a good qualifying lap with George Russell taking pole position, Max Verstappen and Oscar Piastri I got absolutely correct. And so while it was a top 3 not many of us really expected, I still managed to get 2 out of 3 spot on. So though there is another 2 points to me, bringing up my total to 3 on the weekend so far. As we move on to my podium predictions, and I predicted that it would stay exactly the same as my qualifying predictions, a Lando Norris win, Max Verstappen P2, and an Oscar Piastri P3. And while I did get Max exactly correct in P2, I did predict a Lando Norris win. He finished P3, half point for him there. Another 1.5 points added to the total. We are all the way up at 4.5 points to my name as we round things out, as we always do, with my one crazy prediction. And my one crazy prediction was that for the first time in F1 history that I could find, all 20 cars that start the race will finish the race. Every season that I went back to when doing my research for this one showed at least one DNF in every single Singapore Grand Prix up to this year. For the first time in history, all 20 cars finished the Singapore Grand Prix. Absolutely ding ding ding, bringing me up to 5.5 points on the weekend. One of my better weekends on this season and best of all of the community here this weekend. So we're starting to put in some good, we're putting good lap times. We're really starting to get on the pace and we're really starting to heat things up towards the front. So let's go ahead, let's take a look at our standings in our community predictions championship as we now head towards a week off before F1 heads to the United States of America once again. Let's go ahead. At the top, there has been a change. We have British TTG taking over the top spot from Seno 40, now sitting on 63 points himself. I clock in now at P2 with 62 points, just a single point behind our leader. Seno 40 not having the best weekend to his name, now sits on 61.5 points, just a half point behind and 1.5 points out of the lead. So things are heating up in the top 3. F1 Inferno with a solid weekend now sits on 53.5 points, and Andrew and Spectral have no change to their name. It is heating up with only 6 rounds left. I think it could come down to very last race of the season in Abu Dhabi, unless some people just absolutely botch it or someone knocks one out of the park. As we've seen this season, it's going to be exciting. And as always, if you want to jump in on a week-to-week basis and try and improve your chops over the course of a weekend to see, truly show the people that you have what it takes and you have the wheel knowledge necessary, you can join the Discord down in the link below. And we have a F1 weekend predictions channel where we'll make these exact same predictions every single weekend, and we'll see who truly has the most wheel knowledge week to week. But guys, that leaves us with only one question remaining. What is next? I gave it away already. F1 heads to the United States of America, the Austin race, the United States Grand Prix at the Circuit of the Americas. It is going to happen in 2 weeks. It was a lot of fun last year. It is a sprint race weekend this year, so we are back to sprint races once again. It's going to be a lot of fun. I love the US Grand Prix weekend. Why is that? Because I'm going to be there. Who am I going to see there this weekend? It seems like every year it's just getting more and more packed, and so this cannot wait. This is my opportunity to go to an F1 race this season, and it is going to be a lot of fun. I hope you guys are ready for it. Enjoy your week off. We'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about our predictions for that said race, and then we'll get that weekend underway from there. But guys, let me know down in the comment section below what you thought of the Singapore Grand Prix and what you're excited for in the United States Grand Prix, as well as if you made it this far in the video, leave a like, it really helps me out. And as always, subscribe if you haven't already. We'll be back in a couple of weeks for predictions. Like I said, we'll have some sim racing content for you in the meantime. But guys, that is going to wrap it up for me here in this one, and I'll see you guys in the next one.